Wait, what? I can do that? This is Eric Bell with Wait, What? Financial matters that matter for business and the people that own them. This is Eric Bell, and I am fortunate today to have LiRon Anderson Bell, a highly sought-after person in what I'll call marketing for now. LiRon is an assistant professor of instruction at Temple University's Klein College of Media and Communication. She is a strategic communication and digital media veteran with 20 years experience across entertainment, consumer products, the pharmaceutical industry. Her specialties are public relations, crisis communication, and digital and social media marketing. LiRon's professional background includes roles with MTV, VH1, Nickelodeon, Comcast Cable, OKPlayer.com, Bristol Myers Squibb, CDNow.com, The Roz Group, WRD Radio, Time Warner Cable, the Terry Williams Agency, and Manning, Selvage, and Lee. In spite of all these large companies she worked for, I think she has a great style for working with small businesses, small to medium-sized businesses. She earned her MBA from the Fordman Gabelli School of Business Administration and her Bachelor's of Arts at the University of Pennsylvania. She also holds a certificate in accounting, finance, and programming for operational management from the University of Denver. Welcome aboard, LiRon.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Okay, let's confirm something real quick before we get going. You and I are not related, right?
No relation whatsoever.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. I didn't want anybody thinking we had any nepotism going on here.
No, not at all. Not at all. Not that I'm aware of.
Anyway, I wanted to talk. The other day when we were visiting, I used the term marketing in an old kind of traditional sense, and you corrected me or you gave me a bigger vision of what marketing is today. It seems that print ads, business cards, TV and radio, they still are used, but marketing has evolved big time over the years, recent years especially. Can you share with the audience, give us an overview of some of the basic definitions around marketing, just to start this episode off with?
Absolutely. That's no problem at all. So one thing that I think is really important for people to understand is that marketing is a really broad term. I would say it can accurately be used as a kind of umbrella description of a number of disciplines. There are literally dozens of definitions of marketing out there, and they kind of get updated as the business world evolves and modernizes. But let me kind of take a step back and define it as it relates to what I do. If we look at marketing from the perspective of, say, the American Marketing Association, right, the big guy, then marketing is defined as the activities and institutions and processes, right, for creating and communicating and delivering and exchanging offerings that have value for customers and clients and partners and society at large. So that's a really kind of clinical definition. It's a mouthful. But again, what we're talking about is an overarching term that touches all kinds of outreach that you could possibly imagine, from advertising campaigns to social media campaigns to PR campaigns to, experiential events that you might walk into in a convention center, all of that and more. Now, cutting across all of marketing, and I'll go a little deeper into advertising and some other disciplines as well in a moment, but cutting across all of marketing, you have digital media. So that's yet another umbrella term, and that encompasses everything from social media campaigns to ensuring your company's website is properly optimized for mobile devices, for instance, collecting marketing research and market research for that matter, digital advertising campaigns, ensuring that you have a comprehensive online strategy as part of your marketing mix, working with online influencers. Influencer marketing is huge. It's really, really, really got an amazing vertical in terms of the revenue it generates. So working with online influencers and creators to expand your marketing reach, conducting digital analytics so you know whether your web and mobile marketing efforts are even successful, all of that falls under digital media. Now, within marketing, just to kind of go back to more traditional approaches to marketing. Within marketing, one of the key disciplines you have is advertising. Advertising is often what people actually think about when they talk about marketing, right? When we define advertising, that has to do with placing announcements, persuasive messages, things like that. Anything you would purchase, commercials, right? Ads. You purchase advertising in mass media, and the purchasers will be businesses, nonprofits, the government, even individuals. And the motivation behind it is to inform or persuade people in a target audience to buy or know about products and services and organizations and ideas. So that's yet another wordy definition, but there are some key words in there to pay attention to. So things like persuasive messages, purchasing, right? Another thing to be really clear about, and this will juxtapose it with public relations and other types of marketing, is that advertising is paid for. So because it's paid for, the purchaser has a great deal of control over where it appears, when it appears, who sees it, and of course, what the ad says and what it means. And that's going to cut across all mediums, whether we're talking about print, right, like a magazine ad, to broadcast, radio and TV commercials, or outdoor advertising, which would encompass things like bus shelters and billboards, or digital advertising. So that could be an ad on a website, that could be ads on mobile devices, and of course, social media. So when you add social media to the mix, you're talking about buying ads on Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat or areas like that. So that's a bit about digital media, kind of standard definitions of marketing and advertising. But let's also not forget public relations. So public relations, or PR for short, it's not simply, relating to the public. The official way we define it and the way I explain it to students kind of at the beginning of their journey as a PR major is that PR is the strategic communication process through which we build mutually beneficial relationships between an organization and its public. The keys there are mutually beneficial relationships. In any public relations campaign, the audience has free choice among several potential actions. There's no coercion. I know PR has a bad reputation, but there is absolutely no intent to coerce. There has to be mutual benefit for the communicator and the audience in a PR campaign. And, related to what we're talking about in terms of marketing, there is always a multidisciplinary approach with PR. So that's going to mean your campaign will take advantage of numerous persuasive and advocacy strategies that a good PR firm or good consultant will have in their toolkit. So that could be, if you think about disciplines within PR that the average person really isn't familiar with, that could be crisis communication, which is a specialty area for me. It could be external public relations, where you're dealing exclusively with pitching stories to the media. It could be internal public relations within a large or a small organization, and that's communication that lives within the organization, and it's going to be limited to your organization's stakeholders, right? So your employees, that's your primary audience, but also things like investors, if the company is large enough to have those. There's community relations, there's public affairs, there's investor relations, there's government relations, and so on. So I won't go on about that, but there are also outputs to be familiar with. So just like typical advertising outputs that the public and business owners know about, like the ones I mentioned before, like advertising or, commercials and things like that, with PR, the outputs that are associated with us are like news releases, press releases, media advisories. That's when you send a special memo to the media to let them know about something newsworthy that you want them to cover. Even things like op-eds that appear in the paper or infographics, social media campaigns, speeches, blogs, all of that will fall under public relations.
I want to ask you another question. What can businesses do or need to know about leveraging marketing, advertising, and PR today? What would you say they need to know?
What they should be thinking about is how to be strategic about their marketing mix. On one hand, when you think about strategic communication, you're looking at related disciplines like the ones I just mentioned, PR, management communication, marketing communication, advertising. But you can also think about it as being purposeful and intentional and holistic about advancing your organizational mission in your communication. So businesses need to think quite broadly about how they communicate. We tend to focus on specifics and tactics. And so you'll have things like PR, which has typically existed separate from marketing and advertising. If you think about it, marketing and advertising are associated with generating revenue. Public relations has always contributed to sales, but people don't necessarily think of it in the same bucket. But ideally, you want to have an integrated marketing mix that includes all three and their digital application.
So what you're talking about seems like a lot of money to me, or very costly. How can a business on a tight budget introduce some basic PR principles into the way they run their companies?
Some really simple things that business owners can do when they're on a tight budget are some of these examples. First, take the time to define your target audience. That doesn't have to cost any money at all. Who's walking in the door? Who do you see in your office? Who's calling? When you generate sales leads, who are you getting back on the other end of that? Prove to yourself that the people you think you're marketing to are really the right target. And you want to define your audience to the finest detail, like literally write out almost a kind of avatar. How old is your typical consumer? What's their gender? What's their race? What's their ethnicity? What's their religion? What do they do for fun? What do they do for a living? Where do they live? All of that. Once you know who your target audiences are, and this is also free, although you can put money toward this type of research if you wanted to, do some digging and use some common sense to determine where they get their information. And when I say common sense, right? If your target consumers are retirees, then you don't want to dump all of your marketing or strategic communication budget into social media. That's, just sort of like a basic thing that would occur to you as a business owner. It's not that seniors don't use social media, but they're more likely to consume traditional news media. Likewise, if your target consumer, if you do your research, you define your audience, let's just say your target consumer skews male. And you don't want to use up all of your marketing budget on media outlets that cater to women, right? So some of this is really, really just right at your fingertips as a business owner. Place or pitch your messages in the outlets where your target audiences get their information. Another thing, decide how you're going to evaluate your results. That's completely free. Now, you may decide to purchase analytics types of software or proprietary, measurement systems, and that will depend on budget, but that's not mandatory. If you want to, for instance, evaluate how your newly revamped website is doing, Google Analytics is free and it's the industry standard. All you have to do is kind of go into your settings. Someone may need to show you how to do it, right? But you would literally go into your settings, make sure your website is registered, and from time to time, just go through the reports. Who's coming to your website, right? But overall, you want to evaluate your results. You want to think about what successful marketing and communication will look like and what tools you're going to want to help you measure whether you've reached your target audiences and persuaded them to buy or use your stuff. And I guess this goes without saying, but actually go through with those evaluative methods. It's one thing to think about what would look like success, but it's another thing to actually do it and to make a habit of routinely doing, say, a postmortem after a marketing campaign and looking at what worked, what didn't, and so on.
One of the things that you had mentioned when we spoke over the phone a couple of weeks ago was one of your specialties, which is crisis communication. What is crisis communication, if you could define that for us, and why do businesses of all kinds and sizes need to understand it and position themselves for that?
Crisis communication, which is also known as crisis management, is a process designed to prevent or lessen the damage that a crisis can inflict on an organization and its stakeholders. So if you run a chemical plant, it could be a spill in one of your factories. If you are a school district, it could be a scandal where, a teacher or an administrator is behaving inappropriately. If you are a drug manufacturer, it could be that someone dies in a clinical trial. If you are a mom and pop store, it could be that there's a catastrophic fire on the block that completely, eradicates your ability to run your business. And so the reason why it's extremely important for businesses to prepare is because if they get their crisis response wrong, they may lose some or really even all of the business that they worked so hard to build. And it doesn't matter whether you sell products, services, or ideas. And like I said, it could be a neighborhood, using the dry cleaner example again. What if you were, you had the local high school's graduation robes, right? And you used the wrong cleaning solution mix, or you're a politician and you're aggressively anti-immigrant, but then it's found out that you've hired, say, migrant labor and paid them under the table for the last decade. So it has nothing to do with the size of the business or what the business is concerned with selling, but you have to control the narrative. And that means you have to think prior to a crisis even happening about what your vulnerabilities and potential exposures are. It's going to depend on your business. It may even depend on your geography, right? Or a sub-business within a business. But you have to take the time to think about what you're at risk for, what negative things could happen. You have to look around the corner and predict and have a plan for what you're going to do. How are you going to even, say something that seems really, really common sense? How are you going to communicate with your team? If your team is 5 or if your leadership team is 50, how will you communicate? Even something simple like that. Will it be email? Will it be text messages? Is there a place where we're all going to meet? How will you inform your employees? Only about, I think the last statistic I saw, only about 49% of businesses even have a crisis playbook. That's the sort of master plan for how your organization will respond in a crisis. But about 20% report that they don't have anything at all. So the idea is that you plan for what could happen and act accordingly, realizing that you cannot predict everything, but you can certainly increase your chances of being able to respond quickly and convincingly when that crisis happens, because it's really not a question of if, it's a question of when.
I think that's a real undervalued space in marketing crisis communication, especially for small businesses and medium size. They're just going one day at a time, and they think if something happens, they'll just deal with it. But it sounds like they really need to sit down and, like you said, look at all the possibilities and have a solution for them.
Right. People really think that they'll just roll with the punches and adjust in the moment. And it's not that easy. It's certainly not that easy, especially if it becomes something that the media gets a hold of and you've got reporters in your parking lot or showing up in your driveway and things like that. No one's as prepared as they think they are.
And one of the things I notice on TV is that the TV people, the newscasters, will pull aside an employee. How do you go about handling what your employees say in terms of a crisis?
That's a big one. I'm so glad you said that. So the best way to do that is to have a policy and whether it's part of onboarding employees or whether it's part of the employee handbook that everyone's required to read, or whether it's a training that you institute when you realize that this is something that could happen, you have to make it clear to your staff that only certain people are allowed to speak on behalf of the organization. So that's one thing you can do. And it's not a question of threatening employees or shaking a fist. It's just that this is procedural and this is, the best way to handle it. You have to refer things up the chain. However, we're all walking around with free will and people have opinions and they're allowed to have opinions. So if a reporter were to do that and the employee says something that's not favorable, maybe they have an axe to grind, maybe they have a gripe. The way to prevent that before it happens is to keep employees in the loop. What happens so often with a crisis, with a media crisis especially, is that management lets employees know last. They don't know what's going on. They're hearing about things on the news, just like everybody else in that region or anyone watching the media. And that's not fair. It's also not efficient. And that's when you get employees who perhaps are disgruntled or maybe they're resentful about the way they heard about what's going on, kind of running off at the mouth when the reporter sticks a microphone in their face. But if everybody is communicated with appropriately from the beginning, and that's part of your crisis plan, what sorts of information do your different stakeholders need to know? So what do employees need to know and when? What do your investors need to know and when? What does the local police department need to know and when? What does the township or city that you're located in, what do they need to know and when? You have to think about all of the different stakeholders and all of the relevant partners with your business. If it's a highly regulated industry, what do you have to let, your authorities and your agencies know in terms of compliance and when? Think about all that in advance. When people feel that they are communicated with appropriately, when people feel that you're being transparent, and I'm talking about employees as well, then they are less likely to throw your response into chaos by doing something like that, like responding to a reporter in an impromptu way.
I want to ask you, in my mind, not all crises are the same. So how can a business tell whether they're dealing with just an issue or is it an emergency or if it's a crisis? How do you distinguish between those three?
So you want to be clear on these event definitions, so to speak. So a crisis is really major. A crisis is something that's going to be characterized by an imminent threat to the brand's reputation, threat to business as usual. In a crisis, you are looking at media attention, either immediate or potential media attention. And there's probably possible or actual harm to individuals. So that's the bucket of crisis. But an emergency, by contrast, is urgent, but it's controllable. And an emergency is generally going to be characterized by no threat or indication of a problem beyond that immediate thing that's happening, little to no disruption to your operations. There's not going to be any sort of substantial or uncontrollable threat, and you probably will have minor media attention, if any. And then the third area is an issue. So an issue is more or less like a controversy. And with an issue, the benefit or the upside, if you can, look at it that way, is that you'll probably have early warnings. With an issue, there's most likely previous history with that same situation or person, or policy. And with an issue, it's kind of the best problem to have and plan for because there's time to develop strategies that'll solve the problem before it escalates into an emergency or a crisis. And an issue, there's certainly not going to be any immediate harm or disruption to business. So that's how you would look at all three: issue, emergency, and crisis.
I want to ask you, not my final question, but I want to ask you, what are some of the actionable steps that any business could take right now to prepare for a crisis?
The smartest thing that you can do, and I do maintain a short roster of clients, businesses, individuals, so on and so forth, and I work with them to create a pre-crisis checklist. So simple things you can do ahead of time are to appoint a scramble team. And a scramble team is just another word, another way to define the people who need to be part of the decision making in a crisis. So that's your spokesperson, your legal representative, your communicators, things like that. Second thing is to determine a chain of command. So that's as simple as mapping out kind of the flow of authority and decisions while you're handling the crisis. The third thing you can do, identify stakeholders. And we talked about it a little bit before. And don't forget your employees. So whoever your internal and external publics are for any type of update you need to issue. You also, so a fourth thing is establishing notification systems. So what's the proper channel or vehicle for how you're going to notify each stakeholder group? A couple of other things, securing data. So if we were listing them numerically, that's probably the fifth thing down the list. This is important in general, but you want to make sure that any important company records are stored redundantly and backed up. That's just good data and tech hygiene. And then, the remainder of your steps can kind of be lumped into the predicting and planning for a crisis bucket. Consider your risk scenarios. Think about crisis specific solutions and responses. Do what you can ahead of time. And that may even be crafting specific kind of fact-based initial statements that you may never have to use. But if this one particular risk or another issue that you've thought about that you're potentially facing, if that happens, well, then you've got a statement ready to roll. That can go for your digital and social media properties as well. Some companies even go as far as to create a day's worth of tweets or Facebook posts. They will create what's known as a dark website. It has nothing to do with the dark web. It's just a page on your company website that will have all the key information. Employees call this number to see when to report or things like that. And you activate it if something happens. Train your spokespersons and practice.
LiRon, is there anything else that you could share with us before we sign off on this episode?
You want to make sure that it's clear to everyone involved in your business that communication is everyone's responsibility and that the efforts you make have a home, that they're owned, that it's not something you think will just get handled. So whether that's having someone edit marketing materials for you before they're booked, whether that's having somebody wordsmith different types of marketing communication, whether that's making sure that you have trained a spokesperson, whatever the case may be, own it and be consistent with it as you operate your business.
Well, I want to thank you, LiRon, for participating, and you're available for consultations to our audience if needed, right?
Absolutely.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode of Wait, What? Financial Matters That Matter. You can always get hold of me, Eric Bell, at eb@wait-what.biz. Thank you.
Thank you.